In this video, we want to deal with the theory of comparative advantage. Now, this theory is very important as an explanation for world trade. It explains why we have world trade and why world trade is important to us. The method we're going to use to explain it will be diagrammatic. We'll use a lot of diagrams and we will rotate the diagrams to show how they all fit together and so on. So it's important when you work your way through this video that you stop the video, make sketches, draw the diagrams, understand what is happening with each diagram and show how they're related one to the other. It is a diagrammatic, or if you like, a pictorial explanation for why the theory of comparative advantage works. So I want you to work carefully across it, do it a few times and make sure that you've got good notes coming out of the video, and of course top up your notes with additional reading from other sources. So first of all, let's just gently start with the reasons for trade. Well, the acquisition of commodities a country is unable to produce. That's one of the most basic reasons why we trade. We get commodities that we can't produce, or we can't produce efficiently or cheaply. Let's say countries in temperate climates find it difficult to grow tropical fruit. So we import tropical fruit from countries where the climate is more conducive to that form of production. That's not to say we can't produce tropical fruit, people living in temperate or even in frigid climates. We could, but it would be very expensive to do so. It's much more rational to trade with people in countries where the fruit is abundant and easily grown. There's also a saving in scarce resources by specializing in the production of commodities in which there is an advantage over countries with respect to costs. Putting it differently, it's simply more efficient to trade. Sometimes countries have an abundance of resources or have particular skills in the workforce or have natural advantages. So clearly it's worth trading with those countries. It's cheaper to produce. Now, the assumptions behind the theory of comparative advantage. Well, we're going to make two countries. We'll just deal with two countries. We've got a diagram we want to present, so two countries. In this case, we'll say America and the UK. We'll just deal with two commodities. In our case, we'll deal with coal and potatoes. I know those sound like strange examples, but why not? Just any two examples of commodities, so coal and potatoes. We'll say that there is full employment, that output can't be expanded beyond the current levels of production. In other words, everyone who's able and willing to work and has a job and so on, these people are working, and they're working efficiently. The relative price of potatoes compared to coal differs between the two countries. There must be a difference in price between the two countries for the commodities, and usually there is a difference. So a difference in price between the two commodities in the two countries. Now let's start with a diagram. Let's deal with the American price of potatoes relative to coal and say it's 2 to 1. So if we have coal along one axis, along say BC, and AB could be potatoes, then the line AC represents the price, the relative price. So AB is all potato production. In other words, if America operated at the point A, it would just produce potatoes, no coal. If it produced at the point C, it would produce all coal and no potatoes. And of course, you can have anything along the line AC. In fact, you can have anything inside the line as well, but we won't deal with that because production inside the line is inefficient. You can always produce more by moving up to the line AC. So there's a gradation moving from A to C. The more coal that's produced, the less potatoes can be produced, because some of the resources that went to produce potatoes, let's say labour, had to be switched over to producing coal, until finally we produce all coal and no one is producing potatoes. So let's say in practice America produces alpha B of potatoes and B beta of coal. So in practice, let's say that's what America produces, and that's what it's capable of producing. So it produces the vertical amount of potatoes indicated by the blue line, the blue face bracket, and the production of coal at the same time would be the amount indicated by the USA coal production. I'll just put the cursor onto the screen. That's the coal production and that's the potato production there. In other words, they're operating over at this point, which is feasible. Now in the UK, the price of potatoes relative to coal differs from that in the US. That was one of the assumptions of the model. So we have a different gradient of the line. This line here is a different gradient to this one over here. So there's just different different conditions in the UK. At the point F, there will be all potato production, and at the point E, all coal production. And of course, in practice, what the country would do is produce delta, this amount here, epsilon over here. So epsilon of coal and delta of potatoes. So the UK would operate at this point, let's say. Now the Americans are operating over here. So we've got, these are independent productions, nothing to do with trade. This is just the two countries working separately. Now let's take this diagram here and just move it down here. I just need a bit more space, so I'm just going to move this down to here. Same diagram. And this top diagram here, I'm going to turn around, I'm going to rotate it so that the potatoes axis here, this is the potato axis AB, I'm going to use this FG is the potato axis for the UK. I'm going to rotate it so FD is along here. So just rotate this diagram. It's the same diagram. There's nothing tricky about it. So we're there, and we're just going to rotate it, turn it around, and put it down there. The signs are upside down. Okay. Now, so we just took the diagram, rotated it, and placed it there. So now we've got potato production here in America and potato production over here. Sorry, I've rotated it back. That's better. And potato production here. Now you can see what the UK actually produces, and we can see what the Americans produce. So that's the UK and the US. Now go back to the diagram we had earlier. Now we can see the original US production of potatoes, which is this point, and the original production of coal, which is there. That's the American original ones. And likewise for the UK, this is the original production of coal and the original production of potatoes, just there. Now it's worth bearing this in mind, because what we need to do is to show unambiguously that trade, when it happens, no trade so far, but when it happens, trade benefits the countries. So, this is our diagram. Well, I've taken away a few of the lines. But say the US production of potatoes equals 0 at the point B, and the production of coal is BC. It's over here. So if America produces no potatoes, it'll produce all coal at the point C. UK production of coal is 0 at this point, and their production of potatoes could be DF. That's just to drive home the points we were making earlier. Now, if we insert specialization and look at the gains from trade, we're just going to draw on 2 lines here indicating possible trading prices. And these are possible trading prices, and we're going to deal with this point over here. So let's see how this works. Well, you'll note for a start in this diagram I've indicated with face brackets a point up here, one here, one here, and one over here. And you'll see that this red line here, this new one, represents more potatoes and also more coal for the Americans. Also more potatoes and more coal for the British, for the UK. So we call that a gain from trade, but that's also a gain from trade, as is that a gain from trade, and of course that one is a gain from trade. So we got our 4 gains from trade. And that's, we'll call it the free trade price. Now, you can see here that, let's take this point here, this is on the potatoes axis. This is the US consumption of potatoes, and this would be the UK exports of potatoes. So the UK is exporting potatoes to America. The Americans are consuming this much, which is more than they had before. And this is the UK consumption of potatoes, which is more than it had before. This is the US consumption of coal, which is more than it had before, and the UK export of coal, which goes to the UK to pay for the potatoes, which means the UK gets more coal than if it had produced it itself. Now, look at the lines inside here. These were the originals. That's the UK consumption of coal, no trade. This is the consumption of coal, free trade. It's much bigger. Well, it's this bigger here. That's the US consumption of potatoes. Goes up to the red line here. And that's what it was previously. So America is clearly better off. They have more potatoes and more coal as a consequence of trade. Now, for the UK, well, this is the UK consumption of potatoes. And that's what they used to have before. That's what they had. This is the UK consumption of coal, up to the red line here. And that's what they used to have before. That's what they had originally. So clearly the UK is better off because of trade. So America is better off and the UK is better off. Both countries have benefited from trade. So if the US specializes in the production of coal and the UK specializes in the production of potatoes, both will gain from trade. Both countries are better off. And that's the idea behind comparative advantage. That both countries, by specializing, are able to produce more and trade the surplus for the items that they want. And in this way, the residents in both countries will have more products. They'll have more potatoes and more coal in our example. Clearly, in a more sophisticated world, we would have a lot more than 2 products, coal and potatoes. In the world in which we live, we'll have thousands, if not millions and millions of products traded. But the idea behind the trade is that there is specialization, and therefore there are benefits from the trade. And the diagram we've got in front of us clearly illustrates how this works. It may appear complicated, the diagram, but it illustrates the advantages of trade, the gains from trade. So free trade is a good idea. It produces more for all the countries involved. Now let's look at the criticisms of the comparative model. Free trade may maximize total world output, but it may pay a country to restrict trade and secure a larger share of reduced world output. For example, oil-producing countries may restrict output and thereby force up prices. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, in the past have often restricted output so as to push up the price of oil. They know that there is an inelastic demand for oil, and they know we need oil, so if they restrict output, the price rises. So sometimes, although we talk about free trade, sometimes countries restrict trade to try and push up prices. The model assumes perfect factor mobility. Workers can easily switch between occupations. In the example we had in our diagrams, workers can move from growing potatoes to mining coal. Well, that may not be as straightforward as it sounds. Sometimes workers have to be trained, there have to be all sorts of programs of training, and also people may have different temperament. They find it difficult working in a mine where in the past they worked in open fields. So there's not perfect factor mobility. Workers can't seamlessly move from one occupation to the next. They have particular skills. Specialization involves risk, and countries may wish to diversify. If the example we had with America just producing coal and the UK producing potatoes, that means that the UK is entirely dependent on America for coal. Well, what if there is a political problem between the two countries? What if they have a falling out over something? So now the UK has no coal. It has lots of potatoes but no coal. But also, the Americans would have lots of coal and no potatoes because the two countries don't agree. So there is a risk in specialization, and sometimes countries wish to diversify so as to reduce that risk. Some countries want to protect strategic industries they consider are important for their defense or for their security. And so, therefore, they are not going to outsource that. They're not going to let that production go to another country. They think it's too important for them. It could be part of their defense forces or security industry products. And also, some countries want to protect infant industries. Perhaps new companies are starting and the country wants to protect them from trade so that they can get started, they can get enough reserves before they start competing internationally. And that's the idea behind comparative advantage. I've used the diagrams to illustrate the advantage. I think it should be clear from the diagram the advantage of free trade. You can see that both countries in the example we had, both America and the UK, both benefited from free trade. But then we have the issues that we've got here, the criticisms we've got as well, which should be borne in mind. So that's all I'm going to deal with in this session. I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.